¿Qué tal? Hola, buenas tardes. Los invitamos a sentarnos nuevamente para continuar con este quinto Foro Global de Energía, Transición Energética. Ahora vamos a dar una buena noticia que ya la ha publicado el profesor Jean-Michel Glachart en Twitter, y es que el Perú va a ser la sede del Mundial en el 2021, del Mundial de la Regulación. El regulador, Sinermin, ha sido elegido por la OCDE, ha sido reconocido por la OCDE por su autonomía y por sus habilidades. Organizará el 8º Foro Mundial en Regulación Energética. Esto será en marzo del 2021 en Lima. Bueno, felicitaciones a Sinermin por haber conseguido esta sede. Tecnología y supervisión en electricidad, resiliencia. Es el tema de la quinta y última conferencia de esta jornada. Escuchemos a su expositor, John Pearce, presidente de la Australian Energy Market Commission, Australia. Bienvenido. Adelante, por favor, señor Pearce. Gracias.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, and especially to Daniel and his organisation for their wonderful hospitality and organisation. I must apologise, though, no hablo español, so I'm going to have to speak in English. Although being Australian, some people might think it's not proper English. This session's theme on resilience, or what I'll explain we refer to as system security, is indeed a fitting topic because it's something that has been front and centre of our minds in Australia as we transition from a power system that's dominated by synchronous, mainly coal and gas-fired generators, to one that's increasingly characterised by mainly intermittent, asynchronous wind and solar. But more than that, as we transition from a relatively small number of large, geographically concentrated generators to a large number of smaller and geographically dispersed generators. So today, or this afternoon, I really want to just touch on three things. One, to give you a bit of a background in the way in which the energy sector is governed in Australia, which is a bit different. Secondly, the key reform areas that we at the Australian Energy Market Commission have prioritised, and then some of the events and changes that have been a catalyst for some of these reforms, particularly in the area of system security. We have, I think, what is generally regarded as a fairly unique set of governance and institutional arrangements in Australia. There are 3 independent market bodies that all have very specific roles and functions that make decisions about the day-to-day operation, regulation and design of the market. We have an operator, of course, a power system operator, the Australian Energy Market Operator, or AEMO, who's responsible for the day-to-day operation of the power system and the electricity spot markets, and indeed part of our gas markets. A separate institution, the Australian Energy Regulator, is in charge of setting the regulated revenues for the monopoly transmission and distribution businesses, or network businesses, but also enforcing and ensuring compliance with the rules and regulations that need to be complied with by the market participants and indeed the operator. And the third of this trio is the Australian Energy Market Commission, ourselves, the rule maker. The Commission makes and amends the rules or regulations in order to adapt the energy market design as the technology changes, as the world changes, as the market changes. It's a sort of function that some of the earlier speakers referred to. But we also provide advice to governments to help inform their decisions in relation to energy policy. And being a federation with 8 states and a federal government, that means I report to 9 different governments. The rules we make have the force of law, and as long as we consult about how we're going to change things and can show that the changes are to the benefit of consumers, then we're able to make changes in these rules and regulations that govern the sector. Because these 3 market bodies perform their functions or perform their roles independent of governments, but of course the outcomes that consumers experience, the actual results that consumers get out of this system, of course, are not only dependent on how the 3 institutions perform their roles, it also depends on the policies of the various state governments and the federal government. And it's really at times like these, with the sort of technological changes that earlier speakers have spoken about, that there are great opportunities for entrepreneurs and innovative thinkers to deliver great benefits to the community as a whole, primarily leveraging off those new technologies. And in that sense, you've heard today about technological transitions over time, of which our sector is going through quite a major one, certainly the major one that I've experienced in my lifetime. Which leads me to this part, which is actually part of the most, I suppose, unique set of arrangements in Australia. We have what some people have referred to as open source regulation making. Anyone, except the Australian Energy Market Commission itself, can formally propose and initiate formal processes for changing the regulations. And we have had everyone from private citizens through to the Prime Minister of Australia propose changes in the rules in response to problems that people saw in the existing regulatory arrangements. It's a very democratic sort of process. Our obligation, the Commission's obligation, is to evaluate these proposals against a set of statutory obligations, a set of statutory objectives, which direct us to evaluate all rule change proposals with respect to the long-term interests of consumers, and the long-term interests of consumers is defined very specifically in terms of price, quality, safety, and reliability and security of supply. So with the sort of changes that you've heard about today that are happening in the sector, and with the way in which those changes drive changes in the regulatory arrangements, and with the ability of different parts of the sector or different parts of the industry, consumers, NGOs, academics, as well as any one of the 8 state governments and the federal government, with the ability of all these people to propose changes in the regulations, the Commission has published what it sees as being the 5 key areas of reform that are necessary to help us to manage the sort of technological transition that the sector is going through. Effectively, what we're saying to our stakeholders, if you've got an idea about how to improve things, and you're going to put forward changes in our regulations, can you please confine yourself to one of these 5 areas? And if you have an idea that doesn't fit under one of these headings, then you're just going to have to accept that it may take us a long time to get round to deal with your proposals, because this is where the priority lies. And these reforms are based on, or these reform areas are based on the trends that we are seeing in the Australian market, and are probably very similar to trends that we're seeing all around the world, and some of those headings there are have already been spoken about today, so I'll skip over those. So the first is really a reflection of this shift from large geographically concentrated generators to small geographically dispersed generators, which requires us to rethink how generation gets access to the market and how the transmission services are paid for. We need to rethink those arrangements so that we can get investment in the right types of capacity, in the right place, and hopefully round about the same time. The second priority, which I'll actually spend a bit of time focusing on, is around the system security. And when we use this term, and this is where language becomes important, when the Commission refers to system security, we're talking about being able to operate the power system within a very narrow band of technical parameters. So it's things like maintaining frequency, voltage, fault levels. It's not about having enough megawatts on the ground to keep the lights on. We refer to that as reliability. The sort of power system that's dominated by particularly big coal generators tended to produce those sort of system security services for free as a byproduct of producing energy. It was a positive production externality. But those sorts of characteristics, the physics of the new technology is quite different, and hence there's a need to explicitly invest in those sort of services. Distributed generation, the digitalisation of energy supply have all been spoken about earlier today, and I won't go into those. And the final one is really about reliability, in that what we're trying to do, given the variability of demand and the variability of sources of supply, that adds some not only difficulties in forecasting, but it also adds risks to operational and investment decisions. So we're very focused on maintaining very close links between the financial incentives that market participants face and the physical needs of the system at any point in time, in fact, for any 5-minute period. So these terms of security and reliability, we differentiate them between them, not just because it's useful to think about the production of energy and having enough megawatts available at any point in time to meet the energy demand from those technical services that enable the grid to be operated securely. We also differentiate it because the responsibility for managing those two things is quite different. The power system operator is unambiguously responsible for maintaining system security, reliability to the extent that it's about generators being available when you need them, and investing in new generation technology is primarily driven by the operation of the market. This provision of these security services has really become a priority because of the high penetration now that we have of asynchronous, often inverter connected, weather-dependent renewable technologies. Right now, these new technologies, more than anything else, are changing the way our system operates. And there's a couple of big things that are worth noting. The one that I referred to before, the large geographically concentrated system becoming moving to much smaller module renewable investments, but also the widespread adoption by households and businesses of embedded rooftop solar generation, PV, and battery storage, and of course the digitalisation of interactions between consumers, retailers, and our generators. And we expect that trend will continue with the rapid decline of costs in renewables that other people have spoken about today. Reform is needed in how these system security services are provided, because the levels of things like inertia, frequency control, and system strength have been deteriorating as the generation mix changes. And this is the stuff, of course, that keeps the system ticking along. Significant investments in these new forms of generation have certainly been positive in the sense of being able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the sector. But these types of generation technologies have very different technical characteristics from the ones that are retiring, such as the coal-fired stations. And these types of system services, which you need to continue to have available on a sub-second by sub-second basis. Their needs, without that coming essentially as a byproduct of producing energy, we need to provide our market participants with the incentive to invest in the technologies that provides those services as well. One of the things that happens with those system security services, of course, or distinguishes them, is that you can see a reliability gap coming through forecasts which are made. You can usually see whether you're going to have a reliability problem some years down the track. But system security problems tend to emerge in a matter of seconds, and I'll give you an example of that a bit later. We've heard today about how renewables have become the most competitive source of supply of energy, with the lowest on the basis of levelised costs of energy. And it's a big but, given their different technical operating characteristics, their impact on total system costs and hence consumers' bills can be quite different. And likewise, the differences in their physics impacts on how the system security is maintained. And you can't just simply address that through increasing reserves or simply by having more flexible types of plant around to complement it. So, an example. This graph, and the events, I won't go into complete detail, but this event I'll describe occurred over 87 seconds. The graph shows the frequency and rate of change of frequency at various nodes within the state of South Australia, immediately before an event that separated South Australia from the rest of the Australian market and resulted in a black system event. There were extreme weather events just prior to the black system event, which resulted in 5 system faults on the South Australian transmission system. Following those faults and some resulting voltage disturbances, there was a sustained reduction of 456 megawatts of wind generation to the north of the capital city of that state, Adelaide. And that resulted in flows on an interconnector between South Australia and the neighbouring state of Victoria, resulting in flows increasing to compensate for the loss of generation. But those flows were large enough and rapid enough to trip the interconnector. And when the interconnector tripped, 900 megawatts of supply from Victoria was immediately lost, and that sudden deficit of supply caused system frequency to collapse more quickly than the protection systems could catch them. And without significant load shedding, the large discrepancy caused by the system frequency collapse resulted in a black system event. Most of the electricity supply was restored in 8 hours, but the total cost of that event to the South Australian economy was estimated at $367 million. So these system security events, i.e. the inability to control the system when it's subject to a shock, and most power systems, and certainly ours, are subject to all sorts of shocks on a daily basis, occurred not because of a lack of megawatts being on the ground or available. It's not a reliability problem, it was a security problem. Now at the AMC, we had actually started a work program on system security work before that South Australian black system event, I'm happy to say. But There's nothing like a whole state blacking out to attract the attention of politicians and governments, and certainly after that event there was a widespread increased focus on the provision of these system security services. I should say, South Australia, just to give you a sense of the makeup of generation in that state, the largest single source of generation within South Australia is rooftop solar. There's no coal and there's more rooftop solar than there is gas. And there is more wind capacity than the minimum daily load. So when the wind blows, it has to go somewhere else, and it tends to go over the border into Victoria. This work program that the Commission started and was given additional impetus and focus after that Black System event has required, or was supplemented by a request from the Australian governments for the Commission to review that specific event and look at the frameworks and regulations in Australia that we have in place to deal with system security issues in the light of the changing technology that is connected to the system. What system, the way I suppose we've thought about this work is to define the nature of the technical services that are required to maintain a secure power system, and then think about which one of these services are best dealt with through the imposition of a regulatory obligation, and which ones lend themselves to being valued and hence the creation of a market. But it must also be admitted, though, that there is still some technical uncertainties surrounding how these new technologies interact with a power system and how they react in the wake of shocks that impact the system. So some of the measures that we have put in place, we have done what we certainly regard as interim measures, while some longer-term solutions are being developed. And there's a lot of detail on the picture, but the sort of things that we've put in place are things like changing the generator, the technical standards before they can connect to the system. We've given new obligations onto the transmission companies to maintain minimum levels of inertia and system strength. We've improved the risk assessment tools that the operator has, both for defining contingent events and managing them. An N-1 type criteria doesn't work when you've got a system made up of a lot of solar PV and wind turbines. Taking the operating rules, and some of them rules of thumb that applied in a thermal system and applying it in this system doesn't work too well. We're working through changes in what's called our ancillary services market, frequency control markets. For instance, we are currently looking at the way in which primary frequency control that can come from some of the generators, how those services can be valued. We've improved Black System restart services and clarified the terms and conditions under which the operator can intervene in the market. It's, I suppose to summarise, while these sorts of technological changes that a lot of people have spoken about today and we're certainly experiencing provide great opportunities for innovation, new business models, increased competition, that whole process of decentralisation, digitalisation of the market. It also requires, or poses different sorts of technical challenges that, particularly in a competitive market situation, require a rethink of how the sector is regulated and the nature of the services that you want from the generators and how they can be valued. Certainly in a geographically, well, given our geography, very dispersed, very long, skinny network, and the high levels of penetration of these intermittent sources of supply, it's exposed what we refer to as missing or incomplete market problems. And addressing the technical, economic and regulatory issues of power system operations and security that arise from that technological change is a prerequisite for the further integration of these renewable resources and hence vital for the future of our power system. Thank you.